So hello and welcome everyone to this latest edition of the SRM Cyber Insights webinar series. We've got folks dialing in from the US, the UK and Europe, I believe, and we'll be recording this session to make it available for people to watch afterwards. So thank you for joining. My name's Ted Cowell and I'm head of the UK cyber business for SRM. I'll be kicking off the webinar today and running through a quick agenda shortly. And I'll be joined by a few other speakers from across our teams in the UK and US, who I'll introduce now. Firstly, Melissa Diorio, one of our threat intelligence leads in the US. Secondly, Dan Kaplan, here in London with me. Dan's a director in our cyber business who's run countless incident response matters for clients big and small around the globe, and he'll be speaking today as well. And then Michael Clark. Michael is head of our advisory practice in the US, and he has a wealth of experience assisting clients assess, test, and improve their cybersecurity posture. So you'll be hearing from all of them during today's webinar. Today's webinar is about insights. So what we've tried to do is put together some selected insights from the research projects and many cyber incidents that we've worked on this year. We've tried to focus on areas that we think are interesting, we hope are interesting, and thought-provoking, drawing on proprietary research where we can, while at the same time touching on various hot topics which we know are of broad interest to those in the cyber field. Once I've briefly introduced SRM and got that bit out of the way, I will hand over to some other speakers, and we'll be touching on three main areas. Firstly, surfacing some findings from our annual insights report, which draws on interviews from lots of C-suite and CISO respondents about challenges they're facing and how they're meeting them. Next, Melissa will run through some highlights from our threat landscape review, what's new in the world of ransomware, some thoughts on supply chain risk, and some trends in business email compromise incidents. Handing over to Dan then, who will present a bit of a deep dive on data from the hundreds of incidents that we've managed this year, and he'll try to bring out some key takeaways on what causes particularly disruptive incidents and why. And then finally, we'll hand over to Michael, who will recap on some of what we've heard and reflect on what IT and security teams might best focus their efforts on in the current climate. First, then, let me introduce SRM for those who don't already know or work with us. We're a global intelligence and cybersecurity consultancy. We're headquartered in London, which is where I'm speaking from today, and our around 160 cyber consultants are spread across offices here in the UK, New York, the Netherlands, Hong Kong, and Singapore. As you can see on the tagline on the slide there, we provided emergency cyber incident response services to thousands of clients and partners around the world in the many years in which we've been operating now. We like to talk about what we do, falling into three broad categories, and it's around this time of year with Thanksgiving lunches behind us and Christmas lunches ahead. I find myself giving this guidance to colleagues when they say, what should I tell my aged auntie or uncle when they ask me at the Christmas lunch table, what is it that you actually do for a living? I say it's simple, three things. We like to talk about intelligence, resilience, and response. So firstly, intelligence. We provide intelligence that informs critical decision-making strategies. Secondly, resilience. We make organizations more resilient to cybersecurity threats. We do this by assessing their cybersecurity posture and designing and implementing security improvement programs from small projects right the way through to wholesale organizational transformations. And finally, response. We respond to cyber attacks when they happen, and we help our clients contain them, investigate them, and recover from those incidents. On the topic of IR, it's worthwhile just expanding on our incident response practice, because a lot of today's insights come out of the work that our team in this area does. So a little bit on our IR practice before we continue. Our consultants work on hundreds of incidents a year, and our award-winning team works on the full spectrum of response. So when a case comes through our 24/7 global hotline, we do some or all of helping contain a threat, so removing and preventing ongoing threat actor access to our clients' environments, maybe introducing specialist tooling for ongoing visibility and threat hunting. We forensically investigate what happened, how they got in, how to stop that happening again, identifying what data and systems might have been accessed, impacted, exfiltrated by a bad guy. We help rapidly and secure and recover our client systems, and we engage where threat actors where necessary, and we advise on extortion response strategies with our specialist trained extortion and kidnap response consultants. Finally, we provide an overall crisis management service for our clients, because for a lot of clients, dealing with an incident is a career low light. It's a very stressful experience, a very stressful scenario. For our team, rightly or wrongly, this is the career they chose. This is their week in, week out specialism, and we help our clients stay focused, calm, and effective, managing them through the cyber crisis that they find themselves in. So then, now that we've introduced SRM, move on to the insights. And before I hand over to Melissa and Dan, I'm going to dive, who will dive into some in-depth analysis and get quite technical. I'm going to go through some high-level insights from our annual cyber report. You'll see a nice sneak peek of what that looks like on the screen now. And if you'd like to download a copy of this report, or if you'd like to subscribe for more insights and content from the SRM team, please click through to the resources section of the webinar window that you've joined, and there should be options that you can click through and get what you need. So our annual cyber report is the product of interviews with 600 responders, all decision makers, senior IT professionals from large global corporates. And we asked them about the challenges they were facing, their outlook for the year ahead, and where they're prioritizing their budget and effort. Now, of course, you'll have to read the report yourself for all the good analysis. But for today's session, I'm going to highlight two sets of findings in particular. Firstly, some interesting stats on current average costs of incidents, and then some interesting findings about cybersecurity budgets. So looking at the incident stats then, particularly around incident frequency and costs. So nearly 2/3 of organizations we surveyed experienced a serious incident within the past 3 years. Direct costs relating to a single single cyber incident rising 11% year on year to 1.7 million US in 2023. Interestingly, for those organizations who didn't have cyber insurance, the average cost was about USD 2.7 million per incident. So that's 60% greater than average and 70% higher than so 60% above average and 70% higher than insurance holders. So it seems to pay to have cyber insurance. And I think this talks to how the insurance industry has been doing a lot to inform their policyholders about the cyber risks and the threat landscape, and this has resulted in better controls and response preparedness. It's probably also a reflection of the fact that organizations with insurance typically have, through that insurance response, access to vetted security vendors, forensic specialists, legal counsel who help them through those incidents, which generally means that the response to them is more efficient. And full disclosure, of course, SRM is one of the types of vendors that they would have access to through that insurance response. Secondly, some thoughts on budgets. So according to our research, cybersecurity budgets increased for the third consecutive year in 2023, rising 3%. But that growth is much less than predicted, than what we predicted and what others were predicting in 2022, and far short of inflation. Cyber technology remains the top priority for investment. It's no surprise that that's top of the list, especially I think with the proliferation of MDR, XDR, managed service offerings, and the EDR tooling on the market becoming slightly more affordable for a greater proportion of the market. 46% of respondents identified that threat intelligence was a top area, close to top area, delivering value for money, which we thought was interesting, because we find threat intel much more useful kind of post boom after an incident. For IR firms like us, we use it to help inform our response strategies. Seeing corporates prioritize this area of investment for us was kind of interesting. But I suppose it depends what you think of as threat intelligence, because when it comes to building resilience against cyber attacks, oftentimes understanding who's attacking you can actually matter less than understanding the most common tactics, techniques, and procedures that threat actors collectively use. Targeted attacks do occur, but most victims are compromised because they present easily exploitable vulnerabilities for more indiscriminate attacks, which threat actors cast a wide net to over a wide surface area to have success with. So in that sense, valuable threat intel for us is really intel that helps clients understand the threat actor ecosystem and common TTPs in the round, as opposed to necessarily understanding the nuance between the different groups. And that's certainly how the kind of guidance that we give to clients when we're talking about how threat intelligence can be meaningful to them. So a couple of little areas of insights there from our annual report, and as I said, please do go and follow the links in the webinar chat if you'd like to get more detail on that. I'm going to hand over to Melissa now, who's going to present some more detailed findings from our recent threat landscape review. And I should have said at the top of the call, I know that there are kind of facility for people to ask questions on this. We're trying to log those questions centrally. We will probably, given the number of people in the webinar, will save the questions to the end of the presentation. We've hopefully got plenty of time at the end to answer those questions. So if you've got questions, do please submit them through the webinar, and we'll go through as many as we can at the end. So now over to Melissa.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ted. Yeah, so if we go into the next slide, essentially what we want to talk to you about today is 4 key trends that we're seeing across the year of 2023, which we think are important for you to know and understand and prepare as we look into next year and what's on the horizon. So I'll begin by talking about, of course, ransomware, which continues to be one of the enduring and most prolific threats to organizations. Then we're going to touch on software vulnerabilities, as threat actors have kind of refocused on this strategy this year. I'll talk about the enduring popularity of supply chain attacks and why we don't expect this to go away anytime soon. And then finally, I'll talk about adversary in the middle phishing attacks and the impact that we have observed that having on business email compromise cases at large. So if you could go to the next slide, Ted. Awesome. So first, we're going to talk about ransomware, of course. This year, it would be hard to describe the ransomware landscape without using the word chaotic. Honestly, it was a very interesting year. We saw, of course, the transition away from some groups that were taken down by law enforcement, while there was a rise in a number of new groups on the scene, which created some new challenges for incident response teams. So we saw some erratic and kind of deprofessionalized behavior across the board, I would say. Some actors, such as Akira, failed to successfully name victims on leak sites despite there being no ransom payments, which was kind of a curveball, very interesting. We also saw some really heated and targeted negotiation tactics, such as Black Cat using the threat of, or potentially actually the submission of, SEC complaints of non-compliance for victims to try to encourage payments. So across the year, very interesting. And overall, we did see this shift from to big game hunting in an attempt for these threat actors to regain on their losses from the prior 2 years and really make this year a lucrative one. And we are definitely seeing that has been the case. We're on track to be the second highest year for ransomware on record, and we're not seeing signs of this abating. I think, when we look at the numbers of attacks of what we've seen thus far, you can see by looking at the victims on threat actor leak sites, 2023 is absolutely outpacing the prior 2 years, but really this is just a portion of the numbers of what's really going on here. This is just a drop in the bucket, really, because when we look at the numbers within SRM's own incident response practice. 63% of the victims that we supported across the year were never named on a leak site. And this is regardless of whether they made a payment, regardless of the threat actor that they happen to be engaging with. So really, this is just the tip of the iceberg here. And Ted, as you go to the next slide, we also saw some really interesting developments with respect to ransom payments in general. So we mentioned that, a number of these victims, whether or not they made a payment, didn't end up on a leak site, which is very interesting. And according to SRM's own data, 37% of the victims that we supported this year, which did not pay a ransom, also did not end up on a threat actor leak site despite not making a payment. So this is a really staggering figure, very interesting. And there are a couple of factors which could help explain that. One of which being, some of these new, less professional actors that are not really following through on their threats, but there are also some other trends at play here. So we did see that overall this year there was a slight reduction in ransom payment from the years prior. So this is really encouraging, and I think that we can derive some insights from this. One being that organizations are becoming increasingly resilient. So ransomware has been around for a while. Victims are understanding, or organizations are learning how to employ the right controls in order to protect themselves against this type of attack from occurring in the first place, but also to be able to weather the storm in the event that they are impacted by an incident like this. So organizations are really amping up their backups, having a way to get back to business in the event that the worst happens. And I think another factor that we're seeing here is the complex sanctions landscape. As more of these cryptocurrency mixers and exchanges are being sanctioned, as well as dark markets, which are used to launder money, we're seeing that it's becoming increasingly complex to understand the level of sanctions exposure that victims may be experiencing. So it's harder to ensure that you're not going to be violating sanctions requirements, and that has discouraged some victims from making a payment. But we're also seeing some interesting changes in payment drivers overall. So while it is still true that the majority of victims are making a payment in order to reduce business impact losses, we're also seeing that protection of sensitive data is rising as a factor for victims to make that payment in the first place. So this is just a broad overview, lots more to unpack here at a later time, but Ted, let's move on to software vulnerabilities for the interest of time. Awesome. So essentially, software vulnerabilities are another really interesting trend that we're seeing across this year. We've seen all manner of threat actors shift towards this focus in software vulnerability, which is new. As you can see, looking at the graph, 2022, there was a bit of dip in activity from the prior year. But as far as the activity that we've seen in 2023, we're on pace to likely meet that 2021 figure. So all types of threat actors are beginning to leverage or looking to leverage these software vulnerabilities as an initial access vector, and that includes state and nation state actors and organized criminal groups alike. We've seen this focus on 0 days, and so far this year, we've seen roughly about 58 of these 0 days that have been exploited in the wild. But, depending on how the rest of the year goes, we are expecting this number to continue to increase. And of course, the news cycle was dominated by coverage of some of these software vulnerabilities. It's hard not to mention MOVEit here, which really dominated the conversation and impacted thousands of organizations. And more recently, we've seen Citrix Bleed really having an impact on organizations here. So Ted, if we can move on. Again, another trend that we've noticed this year is kind of the enduring popularity of the supply chain attack. And I think that this really aligns well with a shift to big threat hunting across some of these actors' activities. And when we look at supply chain attacks, we can really see them manifesting in one of these three key risk scenarios. So when you try to think about how to proactively mitigate supply chain attacks, it's important to keep these in mind. So we might see this manifesting with the exploit of a very widely and popularly used software. An example of this that we could think of is CLOP targeting file transfer software that's relied on by numerous industries. By just targeting this one software, a threat actor can gain access to tens, if not hundreds of victims that way. Another way that we've seen this manifest is through managed service providers. So a good example of this, a bit historical, but the Kaseya attack in 2021, essentially because of Kaseya's role in providing these services, it allowed threat actors to gain access to tens and hundreds of these small and medium-sized businesses, which then they could exploit further. And we know that small and medium businesses are a favored target of cyber criminals because they're perceived to have a more immature security posture. And finally, this could also manifest in an attack against a single service provider. Think about the potential impact of an attack against a telecommunications provider and the downstream impact that that could have on all of the clients that rely on that service to do their business. And really, all of these attacks are about threat actors looking to work smarter and not harder, right? So they're looking to try to find one victim, which they then can leverage access to attack hundreds of victims. And Ted, if we move on to the next slide, if we just look at this very simplistic bird's eye view of CLOP campaigns over time, starting in December of 2020, we can really see that they are leveraging and focusing on these types of large campaigns. They're lying in wait until they have the data that they need in order to create these really dramatic and wide-reaching attacks, most recently of which was, of course, MOVEit in May of this year, which caused this mass extortion event. And it's impacted, seemingly at least 4,000 organizations, but the impacts are still being analyzed today. So what does this mean for us trying to mitigate these risks for the future? Well, we don't see this going away anytime soon. Actors are going to continue to leverage this tactic because it's a way that they can get they can drive maximum impact for limited effort. So this really highlights the importance of proactive supply chain management from a mitigation perspective. And finally, the last really interesting trend that we wanted to discuss with you today is the impact that adversary in the middle phishing attacks are having on the broader business email compromise landscape. So it's interesting in particular to me because these adversary in the middle attacks are not necessarily new. We've seen these for many years now, even back to 2017. However, what's changing is the types of people that are engaging with these specific attacks. So in prior years, this was something that only the most sophisticated actors really knew how to accomplish. But now, due to the proliferation of these phishing kits and phishing as a service offerings on the dark web, we're really just seeing a lower barrier of entry here. And essentially anybody who has enough money to pay for these services, which honestly aren't that expensive, can kind of get in on this game and attempt to use this type of service to make a buck. And so this is really complicating the landscape and really increasing the threat overall. As you can see here from this slide, SRM personally has experienced a 48% increase in business email compromises this year, which is just an outstanding figure. And really, in terms of who's impacted by this, you can also see on the slide, it's really no contest here. Legal is being impacted the most, shortly followed by manufacturing, as many of these criminals are using more of these services. And lastly, just to touch on a couple other trends and ecosystem developments which have been leading to this increase, it's hard not to mention the introduction of AI, which is helping numerous threat actors, even those unsophisticated ones, craft really convincing messaging, which is getting more victims to click on content. We're also seeing threat actors become really savvy and move beyond just email estates and mobile phones. And now they started to use Teams as a way to leverage these types of attacks. And understandably, Teams is a platform that many of us use at work, and it feels very safe and comfortable. We're not expecting to be phished over Teams. And so this led to many attacks this year. And finally, we're also seeing the development and use of QR code phishing, which is also known as quishing, which is very cringe to say, but essentially threat actors have just perceived that if they can hide their messaging within this QR code, they're able to subvert a lot of the traditional spam filters that are on our emails, and they're more likely to get a user to at least open or see their message, which increases then the chance that they might engage with this content. So as you can see, this is a very brief summary of just some high-level trends that we find really interesting here at SRM. That concludes my portion of the presentation today, but please don't hesitate to engage with us by asking questions now, following up with us later, or looking out for our insights where we'll delve into a lot of this in even further detail.
Thanks, Melissa. That was brilliant and right on schedule. So thank you for sticking to your portion of the speaking order. So I'm now going to hand over to Dan Kaplan, who is going to, as I mentioned at the beginning, dive a little bit deeper into the incidents that we've been working on this year. Every year at SRM, we try to, run up-to-date analysis on all of the incidents that we work on to try and surface interesting insights for our clients, and also for scenarios like this where we're running webinars for the general public. So I'll hand over to Dan now.
Every year we do a bit of a look back at all the incidents we've responded to, like Ted was saying, and try and identify out of those incidents a subset where we think the response was perhaps more painful or more costly than it could have been based on the kind of initial circumstances and our experience of how these things normally run. And so this year that involved looking over 444 different incidents, out of which we identified 44 which were in that kind of more painful, more costly category. And from there, what we tried to do, and we do this as mentioned every year, we tried to group the factors that we think caused those incidents to be more painful, more costly, slower to resolve, together into common themes. And we came up with 21 this year. So that's really what the review does. If you move on, Ted, to the next slide. This slide's quite busy, and I'm going to dwell on it for not too long. But just to kind of illustrate those 21 factors you can see along the left-hand side there. What we found this year is that they really kind of grouped into two broad categories. Things that, actions that the victims of the attacks took or didn't take at the right time in the response that led to problems with the response, even with our support, frankly. So things like switching between different vendors that they might have had in place to look after one part of the technology that was affected, slowing down recoveries at times, or breakdowns in communication coordination between executives and technical teams, or even misguided containment actions at the beginning of a response where a victim of a cyber attack took an action that they thought would kind of help them stop the spread of, for example, a ransomware incident, but actually ended up corrupting data that they later would needed to recover. And then the second group was around less about the kind of decisions and processes that went wrong, but more about the circumstances of the environments that we walked into, where had things been different, the recovery might have been swifter, might have been easier to do. So those are recovery effectiveness issues include things like situations where there were no secure backups that could be used to recover when, let's say, data was encrypted in a ransomware attack. They also included issues around actually the kind of the in-house IT teams' resources and their ability to collaborate with us. In one memorable case I worked on, the IT manager quit in the middle of the response, and there wasn't anyone else really who had the same kind of level of knowledge of the network who could help us get engaged to help that client recover. So those kinds of issues. And The last thing I'll say on this slide is, if those are the two kind of groups of factors, what we then did with those 21 factors was to try and, first of all, identify the frequency with which they occurred across these 44 higher cost incidents. And as you'll see from the kind of numbers there, actually what happened in reality, there were often lots of cases where multiple factors applied. And so it usually was a combination of these issues causing that response to be quite painful. And then we also, for each time the factor appeared, tried to qualify that into a low or medium or high impact on costs. So with that said, I'm not going to read through or go through every single factor we came up with, but I am going to try and draw out some key themes. So Ted, if you want to move on, I'll go through what changed from last year's review to this year, and then I'll talk about what the kind of key themes or takeaways I think we can share in terms of what caused the biggest negative impacts on responses, and then hopefully we'll get to the lessons part where we share our ideas about what you can do to avoid you being in that category of the costlier incidents should the worst happen. So first of all, what changed? What may not be apparent is actually that this year there were fewer higher cost incidents as a proportion of all the incidents we looked at compared to our last year's review. So the percentage of businesses we ended up supporting where things didn't go as well as everyone would have liked is actually falling, and I'd attribute that to an increasing awareness around the need to be rehearsed and ready to deal with responses to cyber attacks in comparison with in the past. 1 or 2 years ago, when we walked into a lot of response scenarios, clients would not really have thought about what they were going to do to recover from a cyber attack. That's less common now. So I think that's part of the underlying reason. So that's some good news. I'd also say that while 5 new factors emerged last year, we had 16 contributing factors to higher cost scenarios. The majority actually were repeat offenders. So the same issues are coming up time and again that cause responses to go worse than they could have done. Third thing I'd say is that businesses we worked with are notifying their cyber insurance carriers earlier, and which often led to good outcomes, actually, because cyber insurance is often the conduit for businesses to get access to expert advice. And a lot of our clients were actually making that call earlier and therefore getting the advice earlier and avoiding missteps in the early hours of response. Finally, I'd say belying some of the stats you would have seen in the last slide, in practice, again, some more good news, we were seeing better backup practices across the board. A year ago, 2 years ago, and beyond, when victims of ransomware attacks would call us up to ask for our support and helping them recover and investigate to get them back to a secure place, often they wouldn't necessarily have backups that they could recover from, or they might have a small part of the network with secure backups and the rest might have been permanently affected. That's less and less common now. Businesses are catching up with the ransomware threat and keeping offline or separately secured copies of backups in cloud platforms that are giving them much better recovery options. I'd also say that board engagement with cyber incident response challenges has improved, as evidenced actually also by the amount of kind of exercises before we're involved as responders that we do with our clients these days. So if we can move on, Ted, from the what changed. I'm going to pick on sort of 3 big themes. We talked about 21 factors, but I'm going to consolidate and distill it to 3 big themes. So what about what we found? I'd say one of the big themes over the last year was that some of the costliest mistakes we dealt with on these kind of more painful responses were often around the recovery and rebuild process. The decisions made to either deploy 3 tools to solve one problem where one might do, causing slower results, complications, and higher costs just by additional licenses. Decisions made to rebuild everything and endure no risk in the recovery process, so not being very pragmatic about risk, would often slow things down. And of course, where we can advise, we still sometimes have to follow the instructions of our clients. where their risk tolerance is very low, but that kind of lack of pragmatic risk management approach from the business level cause issues. And in addition to that, I'd say one of the kind of other key issues around recovery was people kind of making their bets on data recovery efforts, where people were making promises that they couldn't really keep to kind of get around, for example, in ransomware scenarios in cryptos, where they were saying, going to vendors who they knew through a mate who would make promises they couldn't keep, and that would slow down the process a lot. So some of those issues we experienced over the last 12 months caused some of our biggest pain points in responses. The next theme I draw out, and I've touched on this already a little bit, is that the lack of business leadership engagement with technical teams remains a big problem.
And I can pick up perhaps where he left off. Dan was talking a little bit about lack of engagement from C-suite teams, whereby when we're brought on an incident response mandate, usually speaking with the IT team and the SecOps team, but often some of the big ticket decisions that need to be made to progress an incident response scenario sit at C-suite and board level, and the C-suite board level decision makers simply aren't in the room, and there's a disconnect between those technical teams and the board level teams, which make it difficult to make progress. And I think the last point here on Dan's slide is around requirements from external auditors to assure the integrity of financial data pose new challenges. And I think what this really gets at, something that a lot of our teams have experienced when we've been running incident response scenarios, is that there's a lot of third parties, be they auditors, be they key clients, be they regulators, who have been looking to find and get answers about the impact of them and their data when we're dealing with a client breach. And it's understandable that they want answers to those questions and they want assurances. But sometimes that has presented an obstacle in actually dealing with the incident, running the forensics, understanding what data was impacted and what was exfiltrated, and actually being able to answer the questions that those third parties have. The fact of them putting in Teams meetings and Zoom calls in the diaries of our clients clogs up the response process. And that's more an observation from us rather than anything we have an immediate fix on, because it's quite understandable that those third parties have those questions. How we get around that, I don't know. I mean, our guidance on SRM is to try to push back on those third-party audit requests where you can, try to get ahead of them by providing our client with, if you like, a kind of summary cheat sheet that they can send out, a status update they can send out blanket to all the interested third parties and auditors, to try and get ahead of it so that you are setting the narrative rather than being constantly in receipt of lots and lots of questions from third parties. I'll click through because I'm not sure, sadly, Dan's IT, ironically enough for a cybersecurity webinar, is going to play ball. But just to finish then with some observations before I hand over to Michael. Having looked at the incident data as Dan was going through, what can we do? First, the importance of onboarding. Dan spoke about how in PAR a lot of the kind of high impact incidents had been less frequent because people were more familiar ahead of time with who they were working with, they were more prepared ahead of time, and maybe that they were raising the alarm bells and triggering that insurance response if they have insurance quickly. And that is definitely the case. When we run onboarding sessions for our retained incident response clients at SRM, it allows us to get to know them, their key stakeholders, escalation pathways, key technologies, crown jewel systems, the kind of tech stack that they're using well ahead of time. And the familiarity with that ahead of the proverbial hitting the fan moment means that when it does happen, we can respond so much more quickly and so much more effectively. Second, a similar theme, ensure your IT team has the capacity to collaborate with others in terms of their outside help and also the C-suite and the business leadership, and rehearse those pain points. And again, when we're running onboarding sessions for our retainer clients, often what that leads to is crisis simulation tabletop exercises where we put our clients in the scenario of a ransomware scenario, real ransomware attack, because in our experience, clients don't really know how they're going to respond to those kind of scenarios until they've been placed in them. And it's all very well having a dusty disaster recovery plan, business continuity plan document somewhere on your shared drive collecting digital dust, but actually rehearsing it in a live scenario is critical. Reviewing key controls that impact recovery effectiveness, secure backups, EDR monitoring, make sure that the EDR solution that you've got is properly configured in the right settings, and is actually rolled out across a good percentage of the environment. And finally, build pragmatic risk management approaches in the disaster recovery process. This is something that Dan was touching on earlier around finding that balance of pragmatic incident response, understanding that actually taking a hammer to crack a nut may not always be the best approach if it means that in so doing you're taking business offline for several days, incurring all the business interruption costs that come along with that. Know where to accept a little bit of risk in such a way that you can get your systems back up and running quickly and start operating as a business quickly. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Michael, who's going to just kind of summarize a bit of what we've heard, and then sort of, I suppose, inhabit the mindset of the beleaguered, stressed IT leader. What should you think about, and how should you kind of prioritize your thinking, your budget, and your effort in the current landscape? And Michael will kind of leave us with some key points of wisdom and some key takeaways. So I'll hand over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Ted. Excuse me. Yeah, so I'll try to be quick. I know we want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions here, but as we've come to we've discussed quite a bit of topics today, and as we've come to the end of the webinar, I really want to summarize some key points from the day, as well as provide some insights into, as you heard Ted mention, what we think organizations should focus on, just based on what we're seeing, be it on the regulatory front or just with threats that are emerging threats that are coming out. So as we're really seeing IT teams and security teams are pretty strained due to evolving threats. Excuse me, evolving threats, emerging regulations such as the SEC rules, and flat or reduced budgets. And so, as we think through kind of what should organizations focus on in order to really understand where they want to prioritize some of their efforts, resources, and activities with things like limited budgets, we would say security as a culture. And when you drill down into what security as a culture means, you're really looking at your cyber governance and risk management. So having established cyber governance frameworks and risk management programs is going to increasingly become important, in particular due to the SEC disclosure rule here in the U.S., which will also, I say, impact global organizations that are doing business in the U.S. or working with U.S. public companies. In particular, because this rule itself requires that companies disclose details on their governance and cyber risk processes in their 10K. Additionally, I would say proactive risk management. So, really thinking through how to incorporate proactive cyber tactics such as threat monitoring, penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, and patch management into your cyber programs if you're not already doing so, and maybe even thinking how to taking a look at it and thinking, am I using these tools appropriately and effectively, and am I getting the best value out of these exercises, and the data that we're essentially producing. Incident response readiness and resilience. So establishing and exercising those IR plans. And I take it a bit further to say, also incorporating third-party relationships into the IR planning. So understanding if I have heavy reliance on a vendor or supplier to provide me a product or service, and if that goes down, I'm going to face some sort of material impact to my operations, my finances, my reputation. What is the plan that vendor has in place to be able to quickly restore and get back up to support my operations? And also, finally, as part of, again, security as a culture, really thinking about the training awareness piece of this, right? The continuous communication, education, and dynamic training on cyber best practices and awareness on the latest threat tactics that are being used by threat actors. And finally, leveraging emerging technologies such as AI automation as part of your current IT and security solutions. This is really, if you think about the resource constraint, I think this is going to be a great opportunity to use a new technology to potentially give some relief. It won't necessarily fix all your problems, but where organizations are effectively employing AI, they are seeing some a little bit less strain, and also being able to capitalize on better data and information. So I'll pause there, and Ted, and see if there's anything else you'd like me to add. But otherwise, I think that's it, man. We got about 9 minutes for questions.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Michael. And I think we're going to turn to Melissa. I think Melissa's been collating some of the questions as they've come in. And yeah, we've got time to handle a few. So yeah, Melissa, what's been coming through?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ted. Lots of great questions here, but I guess Ted, a good one came in that I think you'd be well suited for if you're game. Essentially, the question is that if 63% of organizations experienced a serious cyber incident this year or in at large, and incidents are getting more costly, but the cyber budgets are not really keeping pace with that financial amount. The question is, are businesses taking cyber incidents to be kind of business as usual or a new normal? And is there any data or information that we have on whether organizations are allocating budgets towards cyber incidents?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, to unpack a few elements of that question, Melissa, I think it is, in our experience, yes, we, especially for larger corporates, so not really talking about kind of the S to M of SME, but the kind of more mature corporates, they are just accepting that the perimeter will be breached and that incidents are going to happen, and they are viewing, certainly if we think about our kind of retainer sales, so we sell incident response retainers to this category of client with a lot of frequency. They're not looking at that retainer and saying, oh, maybe we'll need to break glass in the event that we have a kind of catastrophic kind of ransomware incident. They know that they are going to have any number of kind of misconfigurations, quasi incidents, kind of early stage kind of threat actor intrusion, kind of staging ground for a ransomware that they're going to want us to jump on and kind of extinguish. So yeah, I think it is just becoming an unexpected phenomenon, expected part of your cybersecurity expenditure over the course of the year, that you're gonna have a number of incidents. As for why the budgets haven't increased, I mean, there are kind of global macroeconomic factors as to why budgets don't increase. A cybersecurity consultancy like SRM would love budgets to increase exponentially year on year, of course. So I think, why haven't the budgets increased? Well, it's probably more a reflection of kind of macroeconomic conditions rather than anything else. Any other questions, Melissa?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ted. I think another one here would be great for Michael, given his role in cyber advisory. But the question is whether organizations typically improve their security after they experience an incident, and if they don't improve their security, why might that be? And can they expect to be hit again by ransomware if they're not improving their security posture?
Thanks, Melissa. Good question. And I think the short answer to this is yes, but the longer answer to it is incremental improvements is oftentimes what we're seeing, where whatever it was that caused the incident, organizations will remediate that situation, and they will absolutely try to prevent that particular situation from happening again. And this is not like a across the board blanket statement, because some organizations will go further. But I think most organizations, or many organizations that I've worked with, tend to be a little bit more focused on kind of okay, how do I get beyond the situation I'm in? How do I keep that situation from happening again? And then how do I make maybe some smaller improvements to my overall cyber posture controls practices that I can communicate back to the board, to our leadership team, and let them know that we're, doing our best to tackle this and future issues. However, that kind of wholesale, look back at your overall process, cyber risk management program, and determining, am I aligned to a framework, for example, that will allow me to to have some sense of comfort that I've got a pretty defensible, comprehensive cyber risk management program. That doesn't happen often enough. And I think what you see, and I'm actually thinking about one of our particular big clients, global clients, where they've done exactly that, right? Which is they've taken steps to remediate the particular incident they had. They've taken steps to try to keep that from happening again, and they've taken some small steps to improve their overall posture, but they have not necessarily taken that full look back, at least not yet. Like, it's on their roadmap that we built out for them, that at some point you're going to need to do a maturity assessment and really understand where your environment is. And to answer the second part of that question, they've actually experienced I think three other ransomware type incidents at different global offices since that first incident that brought us in. And so, yeah, like you will continue to see these challenges until you really, take that full commitment into addressing, addressing potentially, I want to say a weak, but, certainly a cyber posture that may not be as strong or mature as it needs to be, based on obviously your risk appetite, your business objectives, your industry and regulations and whatnot. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Just to jump in, Melissa, because I can see we've only got 2 minutes left, and there's a last question that just came in that I thought was an interesting one. It's a question about, for small to medium-sized businesses, how do you see the trend / split between in-house SOC versus outsourced? What are the pros and cons of each approach? Can't see you. I mean, it's anonymous. I don't know who asked that question, but it's an interesting one. I would say, look, to answer that one, SMEs tend to, for a lot of SMEs, a SOC is outside of their budget, full stop. Really, an in-house SOC is definitely the preserve of the M of SME, and probably closer towards a larger, much more sophisticated kind of corporate, multinational corporate. So that's the first thing I'd say. We simply don't come across many SMEs with an in-house SOC. It's not really what we see. In terms of the kind of benefits about in-house versus outsourced, I think sure, benefits with in-house would be greater familiarity with your team, and the whitelist, the blacklist. They know exactly. They don't have to just get to know you through kind of scoping and onboarding as an external vendor might. If they're setting up your managed service, they're in the building with you, so they really understand what you do. So of course you're going to get that benefit of an in-house model. But equally, an outsourced model it can be entirely effective, provided that it's properly scoped, provided that clients actually understand that when a managed services provider is putting its fees in front of you and saying, this is the discovery part of the proposal, they're not fleecing you when they're doing that. They're doing that for a reason, to get to know you, the escalation pathways, the environment properly. So I guess my guidance would be that if you are in a larger corporate and you're looking at a outsourced managed services offering, that discovery scoping part of the fee fixture that they send you, don't let your jaws hit the floor on it, and don't be scared about the fact that it might be considerable, because it's an important part of the process. Because thereafter, the technology that these teams are doing and the level of kind of skill with which SOC analysts are looking at feeds, is quite similar, right? It's really the differences in the level of familiarity with you. So if you're going for an outsourced SOC model, which may be the more affordable, better option for you as a business, pay attention to that discovery and scoping phase, and don't be tempted to push back too much on the quote, perhaps, because it's an important phase. And if you invest in that phase, the ongoing service will be better that you'll experience. I think that's it. Well, we're up on time. It's 4 o'clock here in the UK. So thank you everyone for joining this webinar. I know there'll be a recording of this. People wish to watch it again or forward it on around their organizations. Please stay tuned. Have a look for further upcoming webinars. You can find details of these on our website, on our LinkedIn page, and we will be doing these quarterly, surfacing hopefully interesting things, as hopefully today's insights were, to do with the current work that we're doing on the incident response side, as well as the proactive services side. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Melissa, Michael, and Dan, and look forward to seeing you again next time. So thank you very much.